My name is Linda Mason. I'm 65 years old. And this past Christmas, my son looked me in the eyes and told me I was already dead to him. I wasn't expecting the words. I wasn't prepared for the silence that followed, or the way every fork paused in mid-air as if time itself had flinched. We were in the living room of my daughter-in-law's home just outside Columbus. Warm lights. Candles on the windowsill. The smell of roasted turkey mixing with cinnamon from a store-bought pie. Everything looked like a postcard. But under the surface, it always felt like a performance. I remember standing near the hallway entrance, coat still in my hands, and catching the shift in my son's eyes as he stood at the head of the table. Jacob, 39. A man who once clung to my legs during thunderstorms, now straightening his shoulders like a stranger. He spoke like he'd rehearsed it. Calm. Final. And what he said wasn't loud. But it was loud enough. In our eyes. You're already dead. Not in anger. Not in grief. Just dismissal. The room went still. Margaret, my sister, froze mid-sip. My cousin Kim looked away. I could feel the weight of all their eyes on me, some curious, some pitying. None brave enough to interrupt the moment, and I just stood there. Heart thudding. Throat tight. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. But something shifted deep inside me. And that's where this story begins. Because sometimes, dying in someone else's eyes is how you finally begin to live. But to understand how I got to that moment, you have to know where I came from. Let me take you back. To understand what happened that Christmas, you'd have to go way back to a childhood wrapped in silence and invisible rules. I grew up in a 2-story house in Akron, Ohio. Nothing fancy. Just a narrow porch, creaky steps, and a mother who believed discipline was the purest form of love. Her name was Donna. But to me, she was mostly just mother. Never mom. Never warm. Never soft. She ran the house like a captain runs a ship, meticulous, efficient, and merciless with mistakes. The scent of lemon polish and starch clung to every corner, every action, every word. Felt measured against a standard I could never seem to meet. My older sister, June, was the golden child. Her report cards were framed. Her piano recitals were events. Every achievement she touched seemed to shine. And I was quiet, careful, desperate to please, but always one step behind. If June was the sun, I was the shadow. Father, his name was Edward, was quieter than all of us. A presence. More than a person. He'd sit behind his newspaper, nodding along to whatever mother decided. If I ever questioned her decisions, he'd give me that look. A silent warning to fall in line. By the time I was 7, I had mastered the art of disappearing. I learned not to cry too loudly. Not to speak unless spoken to. I became an expert at reading rooms. Anticipating reactions. Smoothing tension before it started. Because when mother was disappointed, the whole house froze. There's a kind of loneliness that forms when your worth depends on perfection. You start believing love must be earned. That affection has to be negotiated through achievement. That every smile is conditional. That belief stayed with me longer than I'd like to admit. In school, I never caused trouble. My teachers called me sweet, quiet, responsible, but no one ever asked what I liked, what I dreamed about. No one ever wondered if I was happy. Maybe I didn't know how to be. I remember once, I must have been 10. I won a small poetry contest. Nothing huge. Just a school thing. I brought the ribbon home. Proud. Nervous. Hoping maybe this would be the moment mother would look at me the way she looked at June. She barely glanced at it. Said something about the house needing to be vacuumed. And just like that, the joy drained from my chest. It wasn't cruelty. At least not the kind that leaves bruises. But the message was clear, my voice didn't matter. My effort didn't count. I was background. You grow up like that, and it starts to shape every room you walk into. You make yourself smaller. You try to stay useful. You become someone who makes space for others but not for yourself. That was my training. That's who I became. And that quiet shrinking, it followed me well into adulthood, into motherhood. So when my son came along, I made a silent vow he would never feel invisible. But love, when it's unbalanced, can become something else entirely. Let me tell you what happened next. When Jacob was born, I thought I finally had my chance to rewrite everything I'd lived through. I wanted him to feel loved in every way I never did, to never question his worth or mistake silence for indifference. From the moment I held him, I made him my whole purpose. I quit painting. I stopped writing. Even sleep felt optional if it meant he'd be safe, happy, and seen. My friends used to call me devoted. I thought of it as love. Looking back, it was survival in disguise, the only way I knew how to keep someone from ever feeling invisible. I worked full-time as an administrative assistant back then. The hours were long, and the pay barely stretched. But I managed. I packed his lunches, paid for piano lessons, drove him to soccer practice every Saturday morning, and sat through every parent-teacher conference like the world depended on it. I was there for everything. Every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every exam. What I wasn't there for was myself. There were moments when exhaustion felt like a second skin. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one night, Jacob in his room studying for a test, and feeling this ache, this quiet pull towards something I couldn't name. Maybe it was the art class I never took. Maybe it was the book I kept promising I'd write. But then, I'd remind myself his happiness comes first. Always. Love can start as protection, and slowly become control. I didn't mean to smother him. But when you raise someone alone, when you pour every ounce of yourself into them, you start believing you're responsible for their peace. That without you, they'll fall apart. As Jacob grew older, I noticed the small ways he started to pull away, skipping phone calls, forgetting birthdays, speaking to me like a supervisor instead of a mother. It stung. But I told myself it was normal. That's what independence looks like, I thought. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. He began to see my sacrifices as expectations. My help became interference. My care felt like pressure. And yet, I couldn't stop giving. Every time I tried to step back, guilt whispered that I was abandoning him. I told myself he'd appreciate it someday, that one day he'd see how hard I tried, how much I'd given up. But that day never came. Instead, my devotion became background noise, something he stopped noticing altogether. And when he married, I tried to welcome his wife. But she saw me as a remnant of a life they'd outgrown. I smiled through it, convincing myself that love meant endurance. It took years before I realized I wasn't living anymore. I was managing, functioning, existing around the lives of others. And that realization, it started the quiet unraveling that would change everything. Because when the house finally emptied, and there was no one left to care for but myself, I had to learn who Linda Mason really was. Retirement didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like silence, like a room too quiet after a storm. I had spent so many years chasing schedules, appointments, and obligations that when it all stopped, I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd wake up at 7 like always, coffee in hand, sitting at the kitchen table staring out the window waiting for a call. An errand. A purpose. But none came. And slowly, without anyone needing me, I started asking what I needed. It began with small things. I'd linger at the cafe near my apartment, sipping coffee past 9 without guilt. I walked through Franklin Park Conservatory just to feel sunlight on my face. I picked up a pastel set from a discount bin at the bookstore, even though I hadn't drawn anything in decades. That's where I met Tom. He was tending to a bed of winter roses in the outdoor garden. He looked like someone who knew peace, not because life had been easy, but because he had stopped apologizing for needing joy. We struck up a conversation about soil. Of all things, it was natural, unforced, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to be useful to be interesting. We started walking together, talking, laughing in ways that didn't feel performative. He didn't ask about my past. He noticed my now. And slowly, I began reclaiming the parts of me I had shelved for decades. I enrolled in a painting class at the community center. I joined a book club. I signed up to volunteer at the library on Saturdays, reading to kids whose eyes lit up the same way mine used to before I learned to hide it. I opened a small savings account in my name, just mine. It wasn't much, but it felt like planting something in soil I could finally call my own. That quiet life, the one no one asked about, became my sanctuary. Jacob didn't notice the shift. He still assumed I spent my days folding laundry and watching the news. Margaret would call now and then, asking what I was up to, never really listening for the answer. But I didn't need them to see it, because for the first time in my life, I did. And that quiet, beautiful life I built in secret, that's exactly what made this past Christmas different. That Christmas, I walked into the house not expecting anything different. Same address, same mismatched ornaments, same passive smiles and polite small talk. Jacob stood at the head of the table, carving knife in hand, like he was hosting a political dinner instead of a family meal. I remember thinking how strange it felt, how unfamiliar my own son looked in that moment. Confident, detached, almost performative. The living room was filled with familiar faces, but none of them truly saw me anymore. Not really. To them, I was still the reliable mom, the babysitter when needed, the quiet listener who smiled through every holiday without causing trouble. But I was no longer that woman. And that was the problem. I hadn't told them about Tom, about the painting class or the book club or the account I quietly grew every month. I hadn't shared the new rituals in my life: Sunday brunch with friends, early morning walks by the lake, or evenings where laughter wasn't forced. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want to explain myself anymore. They assumed I was still waiting for their approval, still orbiting around their choices, still defining myself by their needs. But I wasn't. And maybe they felt it. Maybe that's what made Jacob say what he did. He looked at me, voice sharp, not raised, but full of something colder than anger. A mix of disappointment and something close to control. He told me right there, in front of everyone, that in their eyes, I was already gone. Not just absent, not just forgotten, dead. For a moment, the words didn't register. It felt like a dream, a slow-motion nightmare unfolding over a table set with turkey and cranberry sauce. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just felt this ache in my chest. Not from pain, but from clarity. They didn't want to grieve me. They wanted to erase me. Erase the version of me that had found her footing. The version that no longer waited for a seat at their table because she had built her own. I saw their eyes flick to one another. Some startled. Some smug. Some unsure. But no one defended me. Not Margaret, who once shared a room with me through every awkward year of childhood. Not my cousins, who'd called me for advice when their own parents failed them. And definitely not Jacob, who was now speaking to me as if I'd abandoned them when all I had done was return to myself. But I didn't respond. Not with tears. Not with rage. Not even with a whisper. Instead, I stood still and remembered. I remembered every birthday uncelebrated, every art class I gave up, every time I'd been overlooked, dismissed, folded into the background so others could shine. And as I looked around that room, I realized something. They were mourning a version of me I had outgrown. Let them. Because I wasn't coming back. But what I didn't expect was for them to come after me. And that's when everything changed. It happened 3 days later. A knock at the door, loud, urgent, unannounced. I knew before I looked. I opened it to find Jacob standing there. Shoulders tight, eyes sharp. And behind him, Margaret, looking cautious. And 2 cousins I hadn't seen in months. Their presence wasn't casual. They came like an intervention. He didn't ask how I was. Didn't notice the warmth of the living room. Or the half-finished canvas by the window. Or the winter plants blooming in the pot by the door. He came to fix something. To correct a version of me that no longer made sense to him. He told me I couldn't just walk away. That what I was doing was confusing. Irresponsible. That I'd changed. That I was hurting the family. Margaret added her piece. With that soft, practiced tone she used whenever she wanted to sound like the reasonable one. She said they were worried. That I'd pulled away too far. That they just wanted things to feel normal again. But it wasn't concern. It was control. They weren't asking me to come back. They were demanding that I stop moving forward. For a moment, I stood there and felt like a child again, back in that lemon-scented kitchen. June's trophies on the shelf. Mother's critical eyes pressing down. I felt it all. The expectation to shrink. To soften. To make things easier for everyone else. But I didn't fold. I let the silence stretch between us. Let them hear it, the steady quiet of a life that didn't need their approval to be real. Then, I told them the truth. Not in anger. Not to wound. Just to finally say it out loud. I reminded Jacob that I had spent decades giving years of missed dreams. Silent suffering. And swallowed needs. That love without respect becomes a cage. That motherhood is not martyrdom. That I was still his mother. But I would no longer be invisible. He tried to speak. I raised a hand. Calm. Certain. And for the first time, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not rage. Not guilt. But confusion. Like he was looking at someone he didn't recognize. And maybe he was. Because the woman who stood before him had quietly rebuilt her world, brushstroke by brushstroke. Book by book. Dollar by dollar. And in that world, she was no longer waiting to be understood. When I finally invited them in, I did it not as an olive branch, but as a boundary. I wasn't asking to be accepted. I was letting them witness the truth. They saw the art, the garden, the life, and for the first time, they understood this wasn't a phase or a rebellion. This was a home they had never been invited into, not because I shut them out, but because they never knocked until it was too late. As they stood awkwardly in the doorway, I realized they hadn't come to rescue me. They came to reclaim someone I no longer was. And I wasn't going back. After they left, the quiet felt different. Not lonely. Not empty. It felt like peace. And that peace, it became everything. After the door closed behind them, I didn't cry. I didn't second-guess myself. Either. I just stood there, in the quiet hum of my apartment, and felt a weight leave my body. Not like a dramatic release, but like an ache I'd carried for so long I forgot it was there. Finally easing. That night, I sat by the window, a soft blanket around my shoulders, a warm cup of chamomile in my hand. The city outside was hushed snow falling in slow spirals under the streetlights. Tom came by with 2 slices of apple pie from that little place on 4th. He didn't ask what happened. He just sat beside me. His presence alone was enough. We didn't speak much. We didn't have to. In the days that followed, life went on, only better. The art studio was filled with color again. My fingers found rhythm with pastels I'd once been afraid to touch. I signed up to lead a weekend workshop for beginners, people like me, who once believed creativity had an expiration date. Saturdays at the library became my favorite part of the week. The children would sit cross-legged on the rug, eyes wide, asking questions, laughing freely. It reminded me that wonder isn't something we outgrow. It's something we're taught to suppress. Tom and I kept walking the lakeside path. Even when the wind bit through our jackets, we talked about nothing and everything. About dreams we still had. About second chances. About the quiet power of being known not for what we give, but for who we are when no one's watching. I still thought of Jacob sometimes. And Margaret. Not with bitterness, but with a soft distance. I knew they were adjusting in their own way. Maybe they were beginning to see me. Finally, for who I was, not just a role I played in their stories. But even if they didn't, it wouldn't change what I had built. Because this life, this ordinary, beautiful, independent life, was no longer a secret. It was mine. And one morning, just as the sun broke through the curtains and spilled golden light across the hardwood floors, I realized something I never had before. I hadn't just claimed my life back. I'd finally understood what freedom really means. I used to think freedom was something loud, like leaving a job, making a big announcement, cutting ties, but I've learned it's quieter than that. It's waking up in the morning and not feeling dread in your bones. It's sipping coffee without glancing at the clock. It's choosing silence over justification. Freedom is saying no without guilt. It's walking away from a conversation you've outgrown. It's no longer molding yourself to make others comfortable. For most of my life, I thought love meant self-sacrifice. That being a good mother, sister, daughter meant staying quiet, staying small, staying needed. But real love, healthy love, it doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't guilt you into servitude. It lets you grow. Some people won't like that growth. They'll call it selfish. They'll label it betrayal. They'll say you've changed. And maybe you have. Maybe you finally stopped living on autopilot. Maybe you finally started listening to your own voice. That's not betrayal. That's bravery. I didn't get to this place all at once. It took years of whispered thoughts and tiny acts of rebellion. It took failure, grief, loneliness, but it also took courage. And now, here I am painting again, reading again, laughing again. I'm not chasing approval anymore, because I already have mine. And if you've been waiting for a sign to start choosing yourself, this is it. Because happiness isn't handed to you. It's claimed by those brave enough to believe they deserve it. And that last piece, that's what I want to leave with you. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for holding space, for sitting with my story. This wasn't just about one woman's journey. It's about the quiet battles so many of us fight behind closed doors. The roles we carry, the dreams we bury, the voices we silence, especially when we're told that loving others means abandoning ourselves. But it doesn't have to be that way. You are allowed to outgrow the expectations placed on you. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to start again. So if any part of this felt familiar, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, I hope my story gives you a little courage. Even a small one. A whisper that says you're not alone. And you're not too late. This space, this channel, is where we share those whispers, where stories like mine and yours come alive. If this touched you in any way, I'd love for you to share it with someone who needs it. Drop a comment below, tell me your story. Or just say hi. And if you believe in stories that heal, stories that remind us we're still worthy, then like, subscribe, and stay with me. We've got more healing to do together.